Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Chamber's Pulse on Policy series. I'm Dana Harris, Vice President of State and Federal Advocacy at the Austin Chamber of Commerce. We miss seeing you in person, but the Chamber will continue to do all we can to provide timely information and resources to our members and the business community. We recently launched the Austin, a City of Us campaign, because while we are all different, there is an us in Austin. So help us to be a better us by wearing a mask to protect yourself and others. Also, Election Day will be here before you know it. The last day to register to vote in the November general election is October 5th. Last but not least, please make sure you fill out your census form too. It is very important for all Texas to be counted, and I saw a great web page on the Comptroller's website earlier this week, so we'll try to send that out after this. Today, we will hear from the CFO of the world's 9th largest economy, Texas Comptroller Glenn Hegar. Comptroller Hegar recently projected a fiscal 2021 ending shortfall of $4.58 billion, attributed to the pandemic and volatility in oil prices. Today, he will update us on the economic impact of COVID-19 and what it means for Central Texans as our elected officials prepare for the 87th Legislature in January. This webinar is a part of the Chamber's Pulse on Policy series, and we'd like to thank this year's sponsors, AT&T and Amazon. Participants on this call have submitted questions. However, if you have a question, please use the Q&A button on your screen. We will do our best to get it to as many questions as possible. This webinar will be recorded, and we plan to share this on our website soon in case you miss anything. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Leslie Ward. Leslie is the president of AT&T Texas, where she leads all legislative, regulatory, governmental, and external affairs activities in the state of Texas. She holds a BA in political science, having attended Texas Tech University in Lubbock and St. Edward's University in Austin. Leslie and her husband, Don, have 3 children. They reside in Austin, where she is actively engaged in both her local and statewide communities. Thank you so much, Leslie, for all you do, and I'm going to let you take it from here.
To earn his JD from St. Mary's University and a Master of Law degree from the University of Arkansas. Glenn has served in the Texas Legislature, where he worked on issues including public education, transportation, tax reform, government transparency, Second Amendment rights, water issues, and tort reform. As Comptroller, Glenn is Chief Financial Officer for the world's 9th largest economy. He's emerged as a passionate advocate for conservative fiscal management and government transparency, and has created an efficient and customer-oriented agency. He founded the state's Transparency Star program and found smarter ways to invest the rainy day fund to protect future generations. Hegar's upbringing taught him the core values of hard work, honesty, and integrity, the same values he and his wife, Dara, worked to install in their 3 young children, Claire, Julia, and Jonah. Hegar's most important title through his years of service is the one closest to home, Dad. At this time, please join me in welcoming the person I am so glad is running our state economy during this unprecedented time, and my friend, Comptroller Glenn Hegar.
Thank you, Leslie. It's always good to be with the Austin Chamber, and I wish we were in person where we could all see each other, but so is the days during the pandemic. And thank you for all that you do here in the state, Leslie, and greatly appreciate AT&T sponsoring this today. So as we get started, I know Dana here in a second, we'll get on and do a Q&A phase, but while we're waiting on her to come back on, I'll just mention kind of real briefly that, you know, earlier this year, Texas economy was tracking slightly ahead of what we had estimated last year. The economy prior to this downturn in the pandemic was very strong, so thankfully we entered into a strong foundation. But you know, once we got into the double headwinds of both the pandemic as well as lower oil and gas prices, in part led by the pandemic, but in part also because of other issues with OPEC production and mostly driven by Saudi Arabia increasing their production at really the worst time possible. The fact is, Texas, we knew very early was going to enter into some type of recession. Whether that would be how long, how deep, we were uncertain. We started looking at a lot of different non-traditional economic indicators, because the indicators we look at obviously very at the very beginning are lagging, whether that's sales tax receipts, whether that's GDP growth, and or whether that's employment data. So my staff was doing a very good job of looking at non-traditional economic sectors. We wanted to get several months into the downturn so we could actually try to give an accurate readjustment to the forecast revenue for state leadership, as well as the legislature and the general public, on what are the finances of the state of Texas. We actually closed our first year of our 2-year fiscal budget cycle yesterday. We started the new fiscal year today, so my team's been extremely busy closing out 1 year and starting another year. But in short, when we provided that revenue estimate there in July, Texas went from having a $3 billion surplus in the current 2-year budget. The current 2-year budget's roughly about $150+ billion. And so that surplus of $3 billion was downward revised, as was mentioned earlier, of about $4.6 billion deficit. Now, part of that is going to be covered by either reductions in expenses that agencies have been instructed to give. That's not accounted for in that number, because in fact, while those savings are in the Treasury, that leadership instructed the state agencies to reduce their expenditures by 5% for this 2-year period. In fact, those gains are not actually captured until the legislature comes back into session in 2021 and takes formal action to capture them. So then on paper, they'll be showed up as in reducing that 4.6. Also, we have a strong economic fund balance, and also we have some dollars that will come into the state treasury, has already come in the treasury, and then possibly additional federal dollars as DC is continuing to have those discussions. So that's kind of a short synopsis of where we're at today, and then happy to get into any type of questions as Dana wants to start the Q&A phase.
So let's talk about the federal dollars. I know that we've had several stimulus packages, and there's another one being debated in DC. So how are the federal dollars that are coming to Texas being managed?
So Texas has received a little over $13 billion. That does not include the dollars that have been sent to local governments, especially the largest 18 cities and counties were able to get their dollars directly from the U.S. Treasury. That also does not include dollars that individuals have received for stimulus dollars and or additional unemployment benefits. And so those are just directly to the state treasury. Of that 13 billion, roughly about 6.2, the largest portion, is for COVID type expenses. Now, the Treasury has given some broad parameters on how those can be spent, yet obviously we haven't spent those dollars. They're sitting in the state Treasury, as well as the additional dollars. Some of them have been spent. For example, 1.2 billion was brought into the state of Texas for public education, for example. Some of those dollars have been allocated to the school districts, and some of those are yet to be allocated. So when the dollars come in, they come into the general treasury pool, just like we manage all the other assets that are coming in and out of the state treasury, until we're directed from leadership exactly on how those dollars are to be spent.
Thank you. So on July 20th, you released the revised revenue estimate. Can you walk us through that and your overall economic outlook, and then talk about the next official update, and also maybe walk us through the beginning of session? I know we will have some payments to make before we actually get into the next budget for the 21-22 calendar year.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, the next official revenue estimate will be the day before legislative session, which will be the second Tuesday in January of 2021. I'm constitutionally required to tell the legislature how much money we think will come in the Treasury for the next 2-year budget cycle that starts in September 1 of 2021. However, if the economy changes, adjust from the assumptions we've made in this current revenue estimate. Now, a few of those assumptions, let me just say that every revenue estimate, especially when you're looking at Texas, which is the 9th largest economy in the entire world. Texas is a very large economy when you add all 12 economic regions up. Texas is also interconnected to the international economy, where roughly 19% of all the exports of the United States come out of the state of Texas. So we're by far the largest exporter. And I say that frequently just to make the point that everyone knows we're very connected to the international economy. So therefore, every revenue estimate is clouded with some types of uncertainty, being that we're so tied to the global market. However, this one undoubtedly has greater clouds than ever before because of several different factors. One, We're trying to assume what individuals, what businesses, and what governments are going to do and how they're going to react to the pandemic that we're dealing with. We're assuming in this estimate that the economy in Texas will continue to slowly open up. There will be no more government mandated shutdowns beyond what we've had so far, and businesses will continue to be able to open up. Obviously, that's something that's very uncertain. You know, at the time as we were putting this current revenue estimate together, one of the biggest questions was, would the pandemic subside to a greater degree, especially during the summer months? Well, we had those answers provided to us pretty quickly. Unfortunately, it was not. Numbers increased slightly during the summer months. And so therefore, with all the uncertainty that's going on in the world, but the bottom line is we want to test these assumptions in the coming months. We did have one surprise already, a very big surprise, which was a positive surprise. So in our July tax collections, which is actually June economic activity, we had a positive sales tax month. Now, we did not forecast a positive sales tax month for several months, but that was principally as a result of people staying at home and therefore spending a significant amount of money in their home and around their house for improvement projects. Instead of going on vacation, they were having so-called staycations. And so we had a temporary bump. Now, this month, we've gone back to negative, about 5.6% negative for August collections, which was July economic activity, compared to our August collections of last year. And so my point is we really want to test the assumptions that we've made in the revenue estimate before we make any adjustments. However, if something substantially changes to the good or to the bad, unfortunately, then we will provide a new revenue estimate as we get towards the fall of this year. But as long as revenues track similar to what we had anticipated, then we will give our next update there in January.
Thank you. How has the drop in oil prices impacted the economy and revenues, and will that make things worse for Texas? Will transportation, highway, and other crucial infrastructure funding be hit by these drops?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, we were already seeing some softening in sales tax collections from the oil and gas industry earlier this year. We had seen that for a few months, and which kind of showed to us that there were some greater difficulties in the oil and gas industry being able to get financing from either banks and or private equity. And so some of the activity, however, we didn't anticipate a rapid drop in production volumes. And so obviously that was brought on by the pandemic, lower oil prices, as well as, just to make a point, you know, we did not track how many people flew around the United States on a given day until during the pandemic. And so my staff, we've been tracking every single week TSA flight data is how many people fly through our airports here in the United States. Roughly, in case you didn't know, we used to have about 2.3 million people would fly in airlines every single day in the United States. That went down to as low as 90,000 at the peak of when businesses were shut down. However, that's risen back up to over 700,000. We actually had 800 and something thousand here a few weeks ago, yet that's still significantly lower than 2.3 million. And then you multiply that around the rest of the world as people are not traveling near as much, also in automobiles, not traveling for vacation. And so therefore the point being is the demand is significantly down to what it was before. And so we've had a decrease, not just in price, but in production volumes, which is equally important. And so therefore that impacts our severance tax collections. And directly to your point of transportation, we had anticipated when we closed the books on the fiscal year as of yesterday, we would have had about $1.6 billion that we could transfer over to the state highway fund for public transportation, as well as an equal amount over to our state's economic stabilization fund, or better known as our rainy day fund, our state savings account. And instead, that number is going to be closer to 1.1 billion. So that's a loss of about $500 million than what we had estimated just last year when the economy was doing much better. And then also, we assume now that instead of having about 1.4 billion going into each fund for this next 12-month period that started today, we think that's more closer down to about $650 million. So in total, because it will be a lag before economic output in the Permian Basin and oil production can grow significantly as lower prices and production volume, that's roughly going to end up being about $1.3 billion just in severance tax collections, less for public transportation. However, we do think the full amount of funding of the $2.5 billion of sales tax collection, those new dollars that were provided for transportation a few years ago, we think we will continue to hit our sales tax numbers so those dollars can continue to be appropriated for public transportation funding.
Thank you. About the oil and gas, with the exit of ExxonMobil from the Dow, much has been written lately about the eventual demise of the oil and gas industry. If that happens, with its challenging fiscal impact in Texas, on what new different economic growth sectors should policymakers focus?
Yeah, Texas is a much more diverse economy than it has been in the past, and I'll go back to 2015 and 2016 when we had a downturn in the oil industry as well as the manufacturing industry. In the Austin area, for example, there was no downturn. Austin continued to grow. The Metroplex continued to grow. So San Antonio was slightly impacted. Obviously, Houston was more impacted because it's much more of an oil and gas local economy than Austin, for example, or the Metroplex. And so therefore, my point being is Texas is a much more diverse economy than it used to be in the past. So the downturn in oil obviously has an impact to the state of Texas, but unlike the other states in the U.S. that are energy-based states, those states during that downturn, point of 15 and 16, they had a downgrade in their credit rating where Texas did not. And really that goes to show in part that our economy is much more diverse than many other states, and mostly oil and gas states. And so obviously it hurts the state treasury. It hurts the options and the tools in the toolbox that the legislature has. And obviously those that are working in the industry and those companies are much more contracted than they would before. However, I do know that that industry has been through downturns before. They've always come out of it. And so I think, really that movement of moving Exxon off of the Dow was really not as much to do with the ultimate long-term of how the industry is going to be impacted, but I think it's more of a short-term issue than a long-term issue, because I think that, again, there will be a shuffling of players. Unfortunately, there will be bankruptcies. Unfortunately, there may even be more people that are laid off in the oil and gas industry if prices don't rebound. However, overall, I still feel confident that industry will rebound ultimately and be able to continue to provide funding and jobs creation here in the state of Texas.
Thank you. So you recently met with the ratings agencies that provide Texas's state and local credit ratings. Can you tell us about that process and what were their concerns, and is Texas still a good investment?
Yeah, Texas still is a good investment, and we're still a triple rated state. One of the few that are able to continue to maintain that AAA rating. And as I mentioned earlier, when we had the downturn in 15 and 16 oil and gas and manufacturing, we maintained ours, where all the other states had a downturn in their ratings slightly. And so Texas, roughly, for those that may not know, we always and have for almost 40 years, we send the public school districts 1/2 of their school funding, exactly 49% is what it comes out to this year, in the months of September, October, and November. And the reason is because they don't get their local funding, their property taxes, start coming until January. And so if the state didn't front load a huge portion of the state funding, then those local districts may have to go out for short-term borrowing for cash flow purposes. So the state made a policy decision almost 4 decades ago that we would go out and borrow that money front-loaded. So therefore, we went out and borrowed $7.2 billion this year. And typically our cash flow mismatch of revenues in and expenses out because of public school funding is there in the month of December. So we've been in the market typically year after year. That's something that we've normally done, and it's roughly been somewhere around that $7 billion. It was slightly above that number last year. We anticipate it will still continue to have to be a large number, but really what it boils down to is Texas is still a good investment. The market knows that we're going to come out in the market, and some of the questions that they may ask really has to do with this fiscal year from a cash flow perspective, to make sure that Texas is able to pay back those temporary anticipatory notes. But really, they also get into broader issues, whether it's commitment that was made last legislative session by the legislature for public education funding. That's a big topic of conversation. How Texas is going to deal with higher education funding in the future, how we're going to continue with our infrastructure, whether that's transportation, water infrastructure funding. Some of those issues we have taken positive steps to. One of the biggest questions that they ask us and other states is about our pensions and the unfunded liabilities, whether that's our employee retirement system, teacher retirement system, and or whether that's teacher retirement health care, which is also, as we all know, healthcare costs continue to go up, and that's something that we all as individuals, businesses, and government are continually trying to struggle with to contain those costs. But really they talk more so about long-term issues than it is about short-term issues, when the rating really is about the next 12 months. They really like to talk a lot about the longer perspective, which I always appreciate that, because those are the issues that I'm trying to bring to policymakers as they're in legislative session. I think it's really important. Yes, we have to pass a 2-year budget, but we need to be looking 5 and 10 years out if we're really going to make a better path to where the state's going to go in the long-term future for economic health.
Thank you. So does the Comptroller's Office have information on the ongoing Medicaid costs for Texas and how the COVID-19 pandemic and the FMAP enhancement has either increased or decreased the Medicaid shortfall for this current biennium?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I said earlier that we started with a $3 billion surplus in the current 2-year budget, actually the legislature, every single cycle, and I was there as a legislator for 4 years in the House and roughly 8 years in the state Senate. And so therefore, one of the things that's really hard to estimate is what is your Medicaid rolls going to be when you pass that state budget, and the budget's not actually going to start for about another 3 or 4 months, and then it runs for 2 years after that. So typically the Medicaid might be underfunded. We had originally estimated that it was underfunded by about $2 billion. So that $3 billion surplus was really about a $1 billion surplus. However, the federal government, once we got into the pandemic, Congress passed an increased 6.2% rate in match from the federal government for all 50 states. And so that was for 2 quarters. It got expanded for another quarter. So that significantly helped the state of Texas, which pretty much entirely wiped out that shortfall and was probably plus a slight amount. However, we do know that during this downturn, depending on how long and how wide it is, that will obviously increase our Medicaid expenses as the rolls will slightly increase. So right now it's kind of a little bit hard. We're still trying to get the best data that we can, as well as HHSC, our counterpart, who really tracks that numbers and deals with it firsthand. So we rely on them for a lot of the data and information. But that continued 6.2% FMAP increase by the feds would be a significant help. And that's something that myself, as well as the other 49 treasurers across the nation, we've continued to support and ask our delegations if that's something they would be supportive of, because that would help Texas and help all the states during the pandemic very significantly from a funding standpoint.
Next question. There are specific metrics or thresholds and data points that you are looking at that would suggest, sorry, hold on, that one went away. Sorry. Okay, so let's start over. Are there specific metrics or thresholds and data points that you were looking at that would suggest a significant diversion from the July certified revenue estimate and necessitate another revision in the fall? If so, what are those metrics or thresholds?
Yeah, so really that's going to amount to what our revenues are that's coming in the state treasury. As I mentioned, we had in the month of July collections, which is economic activity, in June, a positive month. We did not anticipate a positive month for a while. And several of the other states were puzzled by why they had positive months, but we quickly figured out that it was really retail sales. It was sales, as I mentioned earlier, that were revolving around the home improvement projects, people not able to go on vacations. And so we felt as though that would be a temporary. It was temporary. We still did have stronger retail sales in last month's economic activity and August collections than we had anticipated in the revenue estimate. However, not quite as strong as they were in the month before. And so sales tax collections, and just real briefly to let everybody know, of this entire state budget, 1/3 is federal dollars, 2/3 is state dollars. Taxes are obviously the biggest portion of the state portion. And of the state tax portion, roughly 57% is sales tax collections. And so that's one reason we talk a lot more about sales tax than any other type of collections, because that's the one that significantly improves or can detriment the state budget. But also our unemployment numbers are something we're going to continue to track, Texas GDP output, but we're also looking at a lot of different indicators, whether it was the TSA flight data that I mentioned earlier, how many people are going to hotels, how many people are going to restaurants through Open Table, how many people are traveling around the state of Texas using some of the different mapping services that are providing their data. So we're looking at a lot of non-traditional data points than we have in the past.
Thank you. I know that the tourism that comes to Austin. I know we've been concerned about some of the hotel taxes and things.
No, absolutely. And that's something that, as communities are trying and would have events, say, for example, Austin is a prime example of South by Southwest, or all the different large conventions that will come, or sporting events here in the fall. All of those have significant ripple effects, and one piece that will determine whether we need to provide a new revenue estimate or an adjustment to this one is obviously, as we mentioned earlier, federal dollars, as Congress is still debating what would be another stimulus package. And so, but we have not taken that into account, because until the House and the Senate agree, as well as the administration signs that bill, we're not going to take that into account, because there's just too much uncertainty as what that may look like at this point.
Absolutely. Have you seen any data or information about how the pandemic is having on the housing market in Texas, including the rental market?
Yeah, right now it has not had an impact to the downside in the housing market. If anything, the housing market, those individuals, there may not be as many people going and looking at homes as they had in the past. So the number of individuals going and seeing homes has decreased, that activity. However, the actual market itself has not softened. In fact, the question becomes, because the market was already tight, for example, in Austin tight as well, and as you're seeing new projects, whether that's Tesla or whether that's the Apple expansion in Austin or some of the other projects, that housing market still seems to have pressure on it as people are wanting to move to the state of Texas. And one of the big questions is, as we see a softening in the market in some other major U.S. cities, whether that's New York, whether that's Chicago, LA, for example, we don't think we're going to see that softening here in the state of Texas, because Texas, from an affordability standpoint, is more affordable than most of these other states, as well as an opportunity for a good place to do business. We have typically been one of the leading states for an opportunity to do businesses, and if people are reevaluating their office footprint and or their location, their businesses, we think Texas is still going to be an attractive, just like we have in the past before the pandemic.
Well, and speaking, thank you for your help with that. I know that you played a big role in helping bring that to Texas, and we're very proud that they chose Austin. Moving on to another hot topic, back to school. So
Yes.
I know you have 3 children that attend public school, and just want to know, are you in contact with TEA and leadership about schools and school funding and what's going to happen?
Yeah, we are. I try to talk to Commissioner Mike Morath, the Commissioner of Texas Education Agency, pretty frequently, in part just to get, because he's talking to all the superintendents across the state. I talk to several of our school district leadership in different venues, whether it's speeches and or phone conversations. However, he's constantly talking to all of them from a weekly standpoint. And so it's important for us to have that dialogue as what he sees some of the needs are in the public school system and those expenses, as well as on the flip side, what we think are the revenue side. So we can have a good conversation on both of those. And yes, I do have three kids. I got one that's a sophomore in high school, and I got twins that are in 6th grade. And I'm surprised somebody hasn't walked in behind me to get something from off the printer for their schoolwork today. So they normally know dad's in the office for the next hour, but if you got to come in, we want to make sure you get your schoolwork in on time. So that hopefully they'll all get to go to school, at least here in our school district. They start next Tuesday, and we gave them the option whether they wanted to continue to stay virtual or wanted to go in person, and figured at 12, and 15, they're old enough to make educated decisions. And we talked about it, and all 3 of them decided they wanted to go back to school. So we're going to see how that opening starts, hopefully next Tuesday.
Well, good for them that it'll all work out. What are the historical precedents telling you about this pandemic? And are there any good historical precedents that are being set?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One, very early on, my staff, as I mentioned, started looking at a lot of non-traditional data points that I've talked a lot about earlier, but also we started going back to prior events, whether that was the great financial crisis, because I wanted to get comparisons to legislators, to leadership, because they were asking what's going to happen, what has happened in the past, so we can get examples. Also, whether that was right after 9/11, because, in that situation, obviously, the airlines were on the ground for an extended period of time, unfortunately, after the 9/11 event. And so as airlines were on the ground, as nobody was traveling, that was a good analogy to what's occurring now. and how long and what are the ripple effects in the industry and how long that would potentially last. Obviously, it's not an apple to apple comparison, but it's at least something of similar context that you can look at. So we looked at several of those different events. One of the points that I pointed out significantly is, say, for example, the Great Financial Crisis. There was about 6-month lag before we saw our first negative sales tax month. And the point that I wanted to make to leadership is that there was going to not be a lag during this downturn, unfortunately, because as businesses were forced to be shut down, no one has in their business plan to close their business for days, much less weeks. And then also continuing, as so many people are teleworking, we've never had quite an event, but the point being is that we were going to see negative numbers very quickly. Whereas in the past, typically it's a ripple effect before you have those negative numbers. And some of the other points that we've continued to make is that as you see GDP growth, as you see employment numbers increase in the last couple of months and hopefully continuing in the upcoming months, that those are some record gains, but also to caution that we're coming off a very record low. You know, and say, for example, that during that first couple of weeks in the United States, when we saw over 3 million people unemployed in a given week, that is largest that we've ever had in a single week in the United States, because the largest one before that went all the way back to 1982, if I recall, and it was about 695,000 people. And so it was a very significant increase in the number of people that were laid off. Now we've seen some of those jobs being gained back, but I just ask everybody to keep in their mindset that we still unfortunately have a little over 1.1 million people that are continuing to be unemployed here in the state of Texas. So it's really critical that we all kind of do our part, as I heard you say earlier when you were giving your introduction before you introduced Leslie. But I agree, we all need to do our part, because people typically ask me, what is the industry that's going to lead us out of this recession? And my answer is typically us, you and I. And so therefore, as I explained here in the household to my kids months ago, wearing a mask is not something that dad wants to do, but we do that more so not just out of for safety for us and the Hagars, but more so for other people, because we want to make sure that we give confidence to all the consumers, because we've seen kind of time and time over with some data that people's reluctance to engage in the economy has more to do out of their concerns and their fears than it is out of government mandated shutdowns. And so we've got to learn to live with the pandemic, and we all need to do our part to be able to instill confidence in the consumers, because I think that's what's really going to drive us to a healthier recovery quicker than later.
Absolutely. Are you seeing that businesses are telling you that they're changing their behavior? For example, are you hearing about businesses reducing their physical footprint or the need for office space? And how do you think this will impact the real estate market? And how's it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Say, for example, in the controller's office, we have 3,000 employees, and we're still working predominantly remotely. And even as I've said from our agency's perspective, even when we do come back full force into our buildings, it'll probably not be the same footprint that we'll ever see again. So we'll probably, something that I've pushed in the agency and challenged the division directors to do, is more teleworking, because I felt like that is the mode that we are moving to. Now, obviously, some divisions can telework better than other divisions. That doesn't mean we're going to be full-time teleworking from now on. However, we're going to have a much more of a mix than what we've had in the past. And I think you're going to continue to see that in other businesses as well. I think the issue is the larger the business is, they'll have a higher percent of people that are teleworking than if it's a small business. With that being said, also certain businesses, they need to have that team environment where you put people around a table and able to have a conversation. When you mentioned earlier the credit rating agencies, you know, normally we sit face to face and have those conversations. And as I can look around the room with my team, I pretty much know and read their faces that they want to add something into the conversation. So I'll add to them. Or it's a little bit harder to do via one of these calls. You know, you can see people's faces, but you just don't quite get to read what's going on their faces than you were before. And so it's harder to read those facial expressions, which is a significant portion of communication, much more than words. I think facial expressions tell you way more than words do on any given day. And so, you know, needing that team environment is my point. So it's going to be a combination. But I think from a commercial standpoint, if you're in other states, yes, I think commercial values are going to be reduced, whether that's New York, for example. However, in Texas, like all commercial markets, it takes a while for those commercial leases to roll off. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. So it's a little bit of time before some of these decisions are being made. But also one of the questions is, as businesses reduce the number of people in their footprint, do they actually need the same amount of space, or maybe more space, or it could be even reduced space to right size the number of people they're bringing in. And then lastly, there will still continue to be businesses that are moving to the state of Texas. So I don't think that you're going to see the significant downward pressure in commercial property as we may in some of the other metropolitan cities across the U.S. and or across the world.
Thank you. What sectors do you think have been hit the hardest, and which ones are be crucial to jumpstarting the economy? And when do you foresee the economy getting somewhat back to where we were or our new normal, whatever that might be?
Yeah, I think a couple of different things on this. One, the industries that have been hit hardest are those that focus around hospitality, leisure, travel, vacation, box store, retail, some of those that weren't able to quickly adjust, which typically ends up being your smaller mom and pop stores, to being able to have curbside pickup. Those that are more of a online base from retail have significantly benefited. Restaurants, bars, those that are continuing to be closed are having significant impacts, whether it's your local dry cleaners, whether it ends up being, say, for example, as schools are closed. You know, the local kolache store or donut store across from the high school is going to see significantly less traffic, which maybe that doesn't impact the greater economy of Austin as much as it would a small rural community, because that's the only one in town. And so the point being is there are significant implications for a lot of those businesses. I think the industries that are going to really lead us out of this has more to do with us as consumers. I think all industries are really critical, without a doubt. And one of the things, I was talking to somebody from one of my colleagues, another treasurer from another state, and they were asking how was Texas trying to take advantage of some potential bonding capacity for infrastructure projects. And I said, well, one of the points that I've continued to make is that, yes, we're going to have less funding over public transportation from severance tax collections. So the $2.5 billion is going to continue to be there. The legislature obviously has the authority to take a vote to decrease that in half, but I think that's a very difficult policy decision. And then on top of that, it's important that we continue to have those infrastructure projects as well as our water infrastructure projects. And the reason being is because those are real construction jobs and real-time jobs that we need to have. But I think really the answer is going to take all, but it's really going to be led by us as consumers, because we're more of a consumption economy than any other type of economy, and really instilling confidence in people so they are more confident to engage in the economy and balance the need to improve the state economy as well as the health and balance. The long term, we don't expect to reach pre-pandemic levels in the state economy, not at least this year, and pretty much not through the next year, because if we fell so far, it's going to take, unfortunately, a significant time to be able to get back to pre-pandemic levels.
Thank you. So one important priority for the chamber is the census, and making sure that everyone in Texas is counted, and making sure that we in Austin do our part to fill out our census forms. Can you talk about the implications of us not reporting the accurate numbers for Texas, and what that means for the federal dollars that flow to our state?
Yeah, I heard you mention that earlier, and that was a very good point. I was glad to hear you say that, because it's extremely important to make sure that we have the right count and the full count, because anything that is undercounted, one, you have redistricting here every 10 years. And so as the census data comes out, that decides which states are winners and losers in congressional seats. And if we are undercounted, then the opportunity to pick up an additional congressional seat is on the line. So that's one important. But then number two, as you mentioned, the funding aspect, because certain dollars flow to the state of Texas either based on population and or demographics, whether it's the number of people that are in different income brackets. And so those are very, very critical pieces. And when you look at the state of Texas from a funding standpoint, the biggest portions of our state budget ends up being public education, higher education, but it's public education. Number two, equally almost, is Medicaid, health and human services programs. So those census data numbers are extremely important. And then also from our transportation funding is really critical. So having the right number and the breakout of people that live in the state on different income levels is really critical from a funding standpoint of the amount of dollars we can get from the federal government.
Thank you so much. I'm glad that everyone can hear you saying it, because I know they hear me say it all the time.
And we pay our federal taxes. The question is whether they're going to come back to Texas or whether they go somewhere else. So we are paying them And we're a donor state. So anytime we can get more of them back here, that's really critical on the important part for the state of Texas.
Absolutely. So one other question, what challenges besides the budgeting will lawmakers face when they come back in January?
I think the two biggest issues that are on the forefront is one, the state budget. Number two is redistricting, assuming we get the census numbers and they're able to pass a redistricting plan, because normally you get those finalized numbers there in the beginning of April. But then third, the biggest question, and maybe predominant before first of those two, is just how the Capitol is going to function and how the legislature is going to be able to do its business. You know, one of the things that we've talked in my office is some issues that are important to the Comptroller's office and or tax issues that we bring issues to the legislature as businesses practice change. And say, for example, we worked with a lot of retailers and trade associations last interim, as we knew that the U.S. Supreme Court had the ruling on Wayfair for taxability of internet sales if you didn't have a physical presence in the state of Texas. And so we worked on what we deemed model legislation to give that to the legislature. So therefore, we did the heavy lifting of trying to find solutions for those that are marketplace providers, as well as those that are what's called remote sellers, those that do not have a footprint in Texas, but actually we need to have those dollars collected and sent not just to the state, but there's 1,622 local jurisdictions that collect sales tax. And to make a point, when we revised our revenue estimate in July from last year, we'd originally anticipated that marketplace providers would be about $500 million in this 2-year budget. Well, in part accelerated by the pandemic, that's increased to almost $1.5 billion. We upward revised it by almost $1 billion. Some states didn't pass those pieces of legislation, which if you were in the state of Florida, you would be crying right now because they didn't pass legislation on it. And so, you know, as things are shifting, that state significantly lost out on those dollars as people's practices change. So we try to look at a lot of different things. And one of the questions we have is how many issues do we bring for the legislature? Because are they still going to carry a normal workload? Is it a less workload? How many people are allowed in the Capitol? What is their workspace? Do they have meetings, open meetings as in the past? Do they have it via some type of WebEx or Zoom type meeting? So there's just a lot of uncertainty. So I think that is the biggest one. But unfortunately, we're not really going to be able to answer those questions until we get further into the fall and see what the fall looks like in having to deal with the pandemic, unfortunately. But I think those are the three biggest issues. And then once you get past that, then they'll deal with the normal mix of issues that usually gets brought before them.
So do you ever miss being in it?
Do I ever miss being in the legislature?
In the legislature, yes.
Oh, I think on most days, no. I like my job a whole lot. You know, I enjoyed the opportunity to serve the districts that I had, really great people, really great part of the state of Texas. I think that hopefully it helped me appreciate how my agency can be an assistance to the legislature. Obviously, we're in a completely separate branch of government, being an executive branch. I'm not a policymaker. I do like policy issues very much. So there are times that I wish that I could work on some of those policy issues. But what I do realize also is that we are a tremendous source of information. We get to see a lot of things that are occurring in the state economy, things that can happen in the future. And so therefore, you know, I hope that at least that prior time of service in the House and the Senate gives me the opportunity in realizing how to relay that information and help lawmakers make hopefully better policy decisions. But no, I enjoy the role like that. I've got a great staff, and you know, it's a really good team in the Comptroller's office, and I've enjoyed serving in this capacity to people in the state of Texas.
Well, you absolutely support the staff, and we enjoy working with you and them. Last but not least, what kind of information can the business leaders provide to you to help you navigate your efforts to reopen the economy and estimate future economic activity and get Texas back to where we were?
For us, that's the most important question that you've asked today, and I appreciate that. You know, right now more than ever, being able to have a glimpse of what's going on in the state economy, more of on a hands level of individual businesses is really important. And some of the points that, you know, I'm kind of making earlier is that it's really amazing to see what the ripple effects are and what businesses are having significant improvements in their business opportunities, how many are having obviously the opposite impacts. And so we wouldn't have been able to really identify a lot of those in the beginning because there was so many uncertainties. There's still a lot of uncertainties, but for example, home improvement projects, it's really hard to be able to get people to do those projects. There's a lot of supply disruptions in the economy. I've had several different meetings with different trade associations helping us better understand what those supply disruptions are and how long before some of those disruptions will be resolved. You mentioned the housing market earlier. One of the significant issues is the disruption that has occurred to being able to get lumber, being able to get plywood, shingles, those types of issues, and when the manufacturers will be able to catch up and how long that will be, which is significantly going to have an impact in the, not necessarily the immediate short-term effect, but pretty short-term here in the housing market. And so being able to get glimpses into those are really important. Usually one of the things I mention is when the Fed puts out their revised outlook for either retail, service, and or manufacturing, my staff will send me the Cliff Notes version, but I'll usually go to the links and look at some of the comments. Those comments that individuals provide are really just a moment in time. It's just that one individual, but it is really interesting to see sometimes the different comments even within a subset in one of those industries, much less the greater subset. And so my point being is some of that information of what people feel are some of the constraints. And lastly, I think because businesses practices have changed to some degree and will continue to change as a result of the pandemic, I think it's really critical for the state to reevaluate some of the regulatory measures that we have used in the past, because business is slightly different and we may need to retool those regulatory pressures in order to make sure that businesses are able to have an opportunity to maximize in their creation of economic output as well as jobs in the state economy. So any type of information that your members want to relay to the chamber, and if you don't mind relaying those back to my office and my staff, that'd be very important, and I'd appreciate that opportunity.
We will absolutely do that. And I thought that was going to be our last question, but I see the Texas Workforce Commission Chairman, Mr. Brian Daniel, is on, and he has a question. I can't not ask that one. What does trade look like with Texas and the rest of the world with the new investments in Corpus going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think Brian, he knows the answer to that question almost. So the fact is Texas has been the leader in exports over the course as long as we can count. As I mentioned earlier, 19% of the exports out of the U.S. A lot of that increase in exports, as we've seen in the last decade, is because of downstream projects, whether that's manufacturing, whether that's expansion of ports and or petrochemical process. Part of that's driven by low natural gas prices and the opportunities that we've seen in the Permian Basin in the last decade. And so therefore, going forward, those opportunities seem to be even greater. And that's opening up other opportunities in other industry sectors as those markets are being tapped, either in manufacturing and or exports of petroleum products, either raw and or refined in some capacity, opening it up to other opportunities. And I think that's one reason that you see Texas continuing to grow in its diversity. Most people don't realize that Texas actually exports more value of product in the IT area than even California. And obviously, all of us know in Austin area what opportunities that's given in the Austin area with that growth here recently, and hopefully that continued growth. So all of the downstream areas on the Gulf Coast have been really important. And one of the things I've continued to highlight is, yes, that may be far away from Austin, Texas, but that's really critical to the economy of Austin, Texas, because it's very interconnected. And so therefore, the point being is trying to continue to improve our ports, I think, is a really key component for economic development opportunities and economic growth in the state of Texas over the short and the long term.
Well, with that, Comptroller, I just want to thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for your leadership and all you've done. And thank you to your staff for helping get this set up and making it possible. And thanks to all of you who participated on the call today. And thank you to our sponsors, AT&T and Amazon. We couldn't do this without you. So please stay safe, wear a mask, and I hope to see you soon. And I'm going to remind you of our upcoming webinars on September 17th. We're having the Google Career Certificates and the IT Talent of Tomorrow. And on October 7th and 8th, the A-List, Up Close and Personal. And then on October 14th, a conversation with the Austin Chamber CEOs. So thank you all so much for attending today, and we hope to see you soon.